The Arab Spring presented a new face of the Middle East and North Africa to the world. Young, educated, innovative, and desperate for change. And though that so-called spring has today turned wintry, Bessma Momani sees reason for hope, something she documents in her new book. It's called Arab Dawn, Arab Youth and the Demographic Dividend They Will Bring. Bessma Momani, Associate Professor at the University of Waterloo and Balsillie School of International Affairs and Senior Fellow at the Centre for International Governance and Innovation, is with me now. Hello again. How are you?
Very good, thanks.
Okay, I want to start by bringing up a map. We're going to focus on the Arab region of the Middle East and North Africa. You define about 18 countries or so. We've got most of them up there. And that's what I want to talk about, that part of the world. You've been traveling back and forth between Canada and the Middle East, North Africa for about 3 decades. And I know a lot of change happened over that time. But in a general sense, pre-Arab Spring, what was that part of the world like? How would you describe it?
Well, especially as a political scientist, I mean, I think that one would shudder to look at the way that politics worked in those countries. There's a great deal of propaganda. I think media propaganda in particular was prevalent, and there sort of was one narrative and one narrative only, and everybody had to follow that narrative. And often it went along the same kind of argument that we need this strong leader. The strong leader is the only one that can protect us from external enemies, and that, you know, we all need to acquiesce, or people need to acquiesce to that leader in order to have progress. And that's what I think really kind of shaped the region prior to the Arab Spring. And that very myth has been shattered completely after the Arab Spring.
The strongmen is how they're known, these strongmen leaders, the Gaddafis, the Mubaraks. Give me more context. What does that term mean?
Well, it's this idea that somehow that the Arab people are not smart enough to govern, that part of acquiescing to that leader is important because of, again, that external instability that would happen if there were all these forces that would come into the country and undermine the progress that's been achieved, and also that the government is working for the people. And that's really the social contract that existed prior to the Arab Spring. You know, it was unlike the American sort of no taxation without representation, this is really the same motto. I mean, don't expect representation because you're not going to get, you know, you're not going to be taxed. And that's changed in the Arab world. The Arab world now has to abide by all of the terms of globalization and neoliberalism, and have restructured their economies in many ways where they are requiring taxing people. But the old system of corruption can't govern or can't work in that kind of space nowadays. They're not able, the government, to provide the kind of jobs and prosperity that they did in the old days, where they had these high protectionist walls that basically didn't allow external competitors to come in. So the entire economic landscape of the Arab world is fundamentally changed. And now the missing piece, if you will, is the political element that is, I think, the social contract that is being basically changed due to the sort of bottom-up pressure against the government.
Okay, I want to juxtapose those two things, because here, for a long time, strongmen, the contract, as you say, was we'll give you security and stability, you give up your freedoms, essentially, not being trite, but essentially that's the contract. And then the economic, there's no jobs. I mean, we know that Mohamed Bouazizi, the guy who lit himself on fire in Tunisia, which essentially people pinpoint was the start of the Arab Spring. It was really out of desperation, of no work. He represented a generation. But here's my question. You live under a system for many decades, and then a younger generation says, enough is enough. It wasn't just one guy. Something happened. What make the differentiation for me between this younger generation and the older one that led to the Arab Spring?
Well, I mean, the older generation sort of bought that social contract, and it worked for them because they got a public sector job often. They had this a subsidized system of everything from rent control to subsidized food. So it worked for them in that sense. But the pressure here is globalization means that this old system, this old economic way of working doesn't exist anymore in the Arab world. So Arab youth are saying, why should I acquiesce to you, the leader, when I have no job? I'm paying full price for everything, and you're corrupt, and. So part of the change in the social contract is that the Arab youth see that the government is taking but not giving anything. There's nothing in return.
No real contract, really. You're not holding up your end of the bargain, essentially.
Precisely.
What they're saying. All right, so then we know all the names of the leaders who've been deposed, kicked out, left, some who are still in power. What we don't know is the names of the leaders of the Arab Spring, the young leaders. Are there specific people, or is this like a movement that's leaderless?
It's very much a leaderless movement, which, by the way, is something that the West is really uncomfortable with. And I have to say, we have to push ourselves to think outside the box, because we are often asking this question. If we're looking at even Syria today, we often hear the question, well, what's going to replace him? You know, there's 21 million people in Syria. Surely we don't have to think that we know the answer to the one person who's going to take over Assad. That's the beauty of a democratic process. We shouldn't know who should be the presumed replacement for Assad. So what I think Arab youth are saying is, okay, there is no leader to this so-called movement, but that's why we want a process. We want a democratic process where we get to choose. We get to choose from a field of candidates who tell us what their platform is. I don't want a presumed leader. That sort of idea that somehow you can pass along leader to one's son or one's clan or one's sect, that's the kind of very, I think, nepotistic system that the Arab youth are precisely fighting against. They want meritocracy. They want people to earn their positions in government. And I think that's one of the things that I chronicle in the book, the way Arab youth feel about things like governance, authority, and power. And they're very much, I think, wanting a progressive change that is going to be based on meritocracy first and foremost.
Not unlike youth in most parts of the world, including our own. The old system, we don't like it. We don't like how it existed, and we want fundamental change. I mean, there are obviously differences, but the youth side of that, I mean, youth around the world are feeling this.
Well, and they're very much the same. I mean, they're very skeptical of authority. They don't believe in deference. They believe in earning. Leaders have to earn their respect, not that it's somehow a given just because of that person's in authority. They're very much the essence of deference, this idea that somehow because this person's a leader, one must obey. No, teach me, tell me why, convince me. I mean, one of my favorite terms in the Arab world that I hear from youth, and I see it in families all the way to the streets, is convince me, show me what you got. Right? I am not going to accept it just because you're in a position of authority. What do you have to offer? Now, Arab governments historically looked at that as a form of disobedience, disloyalty, external actors are at play. I look at that as very much, I mean, I'm a teacher first and foremost at the University of Waterloo, and I see that in my students. Students today, youth in general, because they have so much access to information, are not being disobedient by asking questions. It's the way they learn. They believe in active learning. They believe in questioning as a way to gain knowledge. That's a part of, I think, a smart society, an educated society. And that's exactly what we see coming into the Middle East, thanks to the boom of information, thanks to the education that they've gained over the years, which is really quite impressive. And most importantly, questioning authority as a result of the Arab Spring. So that's the kinds of, I think, cultural and social changes that I try to highlight.
All right. Except for, and I'm going to read a quote. This comes from Foreign Policy, written last year, so about 4.5 years after the Arab Spring first began. So here's what was written in Foreign Policy. Alas, the so-called Arab Spring has not been about the birth of freedom, but about the collapse of central authority, which says nothing about the readiness of these states, artificial and otherwise, for the rigors of democracy. Only suffocating totalitarian regimes could control these artificial countries, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Algeria, Jordan, Yemen, formed from vague geographical expressions. When these regimes collapsed, they left behind an utter void. Totalitarianism was the only answer to the end of Western imperialism in these artificial states, and totalitarianism's collapse is now the root cause of Middle East chaos. So, they say Arab Spring didn't go anywhere. What do you say?
Well, that whole very quote, frankly, I think is at its core very Orientalist. It's this idea that somehow the masses of Arab people have to be controlled. I mean, we have to keep in mind this Western notion that somehow totalitarianism is necessary because Arabs only believe in might is right is at its essence Orientalist, and that's being a very nice academic term for what I think we can really, if we want to scratch the surface, being very racist. This idea that somehow Arabs are unruly and they can't govern themselves, they don't have the functioning cultural prerequisites, and therefore we need these strongmen. I mean, it's an awful, awful assumption. Sadly, many Arab governments themselves are very much perpetuating not only this myth, but frankly, this very successful instrument to control their own population. So they use that same propaganda. We have it in the halls of certain political corridors, and Arab governments themselves, many of them, these strongmen, use that same propaganda to control their populations. So as an academic, and I think many young people who see that, they see very well beyond that. Not only do they say, wait a minute, the source of instability is government, your corruption is the reason why we're failing. It's not because Arab culture isn't conducive to growth. It's not because we're not capable. It's because you are robbing the public purse. So, I mean, really, we have to, I think, in the West, academic, public discourse, media, has to think about how we even pitch these concepts.
All right, except Bessma, if you look at a lot of these countries, I mean, if I just tune in to, it's a disaster on the ground. Syria, Libya, Iraq.
And I would say it's a disaster when you look at governments. First of all, you know, I think we in the West have often failed about looking at the people. We've dehumanized the region. One of the things that I really tried to do in this book is give you a human face of the Arab world, which ironically is really difficult to do nowadays with all the very valid noise. It's not to say that it's not true. There is wars, there is a great deal of frustration, not to mention there's a great deal of pain and suffering on a humanitarian scale that it's beyond belief. But the reality is there are people, there are individuals, educated, smart, cosmopolitan, increasingly progressive individuals, human beings who are behind these stories. And we need to stop, I think, capturing only not just the negative news because we want to sugarcoat the region. It's not sugarcoating the region. It's to say that if you only look at the dysfunctional ways of X government and Y government, you're going to fail to see that the majority of the population are protesting every day in their existence, in their very actions and words. So they're not passive, unlike the sort of old philosophy that we had about the Arab world, that somehow it's apolitical. It's very political. And second, that not all of that political protest is in the violent form that we see. I mean, we only sort of see either they're passive or they're violent. Well, you know what? That's not the world. That's not the reality. People aren't these extremes.
So paint me a picture, because you do so in your book, and I'm not trying to create a monolith, but just give me a general sense of what do they look like? What is their education? What backgrounds do they come from? The Arab youth that are sort of inspiring and leading change on the ground.
Well, one of the things that we need to do is also go into the spaces where they're talking, which is a lot of it is online. Online because it's away from the censors, online because it's often where, you know, government armies aren't able to track them, where they don't have the old intelligence services. So our old view of looking for politics has to be, I think, a little more sophisticated when it comes to the Arab world by looking at what they're doing online. If you look at the online world, the sort of environment of online conversations, it's phenomenal. So if I look at the blogs, if I look at the YouTube videos, if I look at the tweets, the Facebook posts, this is a society that's critical of government, thinking constantly about issues about religion, constantly talking about ways to organize society. They're questioning norms at an increasing place. We fail to see that there's even an artistic revolution right now happening in the Arab world that is extremely impressive, a poetic implosion that we see online. So we need to go into those spaces to get a sense of what's going on. But I would say overall, it's much more progressive, much more cosmopolitan. Arabs see themselves as worldly. And part of that is because they have access to the world today, whether it's media and online, more so than in previous generations. And I actually think that we fail to recognize things like urbanization. I mean, urbanization at its core, and the Arab world is rapidly urbanizing, is breaking down things like sects, tribe, religious kind of affiliation that we have used so much to describe the Arab world. I mean, we unfortunately clump individuals into these monolithic, as you say, monolithic groupings to explain the Arab world, and it's not doing justice to what's the reality on the ground.
I'm glad you mentioned religion. I want to put up a photo. This is a young Arab woman. She's wearing a hijab, fully in fashion. Put the religious context. Again, what we're trying to do here is break down some barriers. And so a lot of people think, oh, Arab, Middle East, religious, and they have a certain idea. How are they sort of meshing modernity, contemporary progressive values and views with religion?
This is one of my favorite, one of the chapters that I most loved writing about was identity. And you know, we in the West, and I hate this because I see this, you know, in all of our discussions, it's sort of, is it secular or is it fundamentalist or religious? It's like as though there is just two extreme points and the whole Arab world falls in either one. The reality is that, and that picture is a perfect portrait of the young Arab, primarily Muslim, although not the whole Arab world is not all Muslim, it's very much multi-religious, but nevertheless, majority are Muslim, which is a hybrid. They have hybrid identities. And when I would pose to Arab youth sort of the typical sort of Western analysis, do you consider yourself religious or secular? they sort of shake their heads. I mean, this is sort of a weird concept that we've brought into the debate, but it's not what they see. They see themselves as they say, very Eastern and very Western, right? I mean, you see these young women who wear the hijab and say, I'm a feminist. You know, these may seem like contradictory terms analytically, but they're very much fused. These are women who wear the hijab, feel very empowered, want to change their society from the bottom up, see themselves as revolutionaries, and do not want to live in a theocracy, which is really important.
Also glad you brought up feminism, because there's been a lot of criticism of what goes on in terms of that and in the Middle East. I'm going to read you something else. This is from Mona El-Tahawi, who you know. She's been on this program. She wrote Headscarves and Hymens. This is her writing in Foreign Policy in 2012. What all this means is that when it comes to the status of women in the Middle East, it's not better than you think. It's much, much worse. Even after these revolutions, all is more or less considered well with the world as long as women are covered up, anchored to the home, denied the simple mobility of getting into their own cars, forced to get permission from men to travel, and unable to marry without a male guardian's blessing or divorce either. The Islamist hatred of women burns brightly across the region, now more than ever. Is she right?
I think she's simplified the Arab world extremely, and not just in her book, but in much of her writing. You know, one of the things that I found in not only these are surveys that have been done, very intense surveys done by other institutions, but also in my travel throughout the region, is that the religious revivalism is not being imposed on people, particularly women. This idea that somehow women are being forced to wear the hijab. Yes, that exists in Saudi Arabia. That's one of 22 Arab countries. That's not the case. So Iran and Saudi Arabia, and Iran is not an Arab country, are the two countries that are forced women to wear the hijab or to cover their hair. That doesn't exist in the rest of the Arab world. How do you explain this rise of religious revivalism? And often when you talk to them, what's fascinating is even in households, there's a generational gap where sometimes many of these young women, which we have seen an increase in wearing of the hijab, it's now 90% in some places, and that's a huge difference from a decade ago.
And yet though, Bessma, you know, the World Economic Forum's, whatever it's called, Global Gender Gap Report, Middle East and North Africa is still at the bottom.
Absolutely. No, this is not to say that they've achieved gender parity or gender equality. I'm not questioning that. What I'm saying is that the choice to wear the hijab is often a woman's choice, and they want to wear it. We have no right to question that choice. Just like we can I defend a woman's right to wear it, I should defend a woman's right not to wear it. This is not condoning the policies of Saudi Arabia or Iran. But in many societies, as we've noticed, and throughout the Arab world, there is a religious revivalism. It's not this, you know, I think Islamist interpretation that Muna is reflecting on. It is in some quarters, but often it's very much this populist, what we would call actually evangelical Islamist revivalism.
Okay, beyond religion, where else are women bearing the fruit of the Arab Spring? And what other sectors? How is it playing out?
Education, by far. So women's actually one of the fastest rates of increase in education is happening amongst women in the Arab world compared to any other region in the world. Arab women are by far becoming more educated than anywhere else. We have reached, perhaps in most universities, women exceeding, actually that's a stat now, women exceeding men in all Arab universities. Now, that's not necessarily true of the labor market, which there is still a great deal of challenges there.
Meaning they're going to university but then staying home.
Absolutely, although many of them, we know, also want to stay home, and many are prevented from working because of the conditions of, frankly, usually unsafe transportation, which is a huge issue for many young people that I keep hearing. So it's about not being able to get on a bus safely without the kind of harassment that Muna adequately and very, I think, appropriately chronicles in her work. But that's not to say that women wear the hijab because they're being forced to. It's often very much a choice because they want to for spiritual reasons. And I think the discourse around religion is not that, I think, draconian Islamist sort of fundamentalist ideology that too often the West paints as an explanation for this revivalism. In fact, it's very much what I would call this evangelical, this sort of spiritual nature. And I talk about this in the book and show how youth have a very different way of even thinking about Islam than the previous generation. The previous generation was, oh, don't do this, don't do that. This generation is God loves you, and do this because God loves you. I mean, the whole messaging is very different because, again, at the core, Arab youth today want to be convinced. They don't want to be preached to or told the way that I think an older generation thought and perceived religion should be absorbed.
All right. we've talked about how the West sees and misinterprets a lot the Middle East and North Africa and the Arab world. I want to put up some stats. I want a couple of graphs. Let's put the first one up. These are from a PR agency. It's called Asda Burson Marsteller. They did an Arab Youth Survey, conducted 3,500 interviews last year with Arab men and women between the ages of 18 and 24. Here's what it found on the first graph. On the subject of democracy and the Arab Spring, it asked how strong people agreed or disagreed with this statement. Here's the statement. Democracy will never work in the Middle East. 39%, these are people in the Middle East, 18 to 24, so youth. 39% said democracy will never work in the Middle East. 36% disagreed, i.e. saying it could work. And 25% are unsure. How do you square that one?
Well, that's really interesting, and I know the polls very well. And so they've been doing these polls for about 6 years now. And actually what you see is in 2015 statistics, I mean, people are looking at what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Iraq, and are very much frustrated and fearful about sort of opening the floodgates of democracy, definitely. But the very same polls, I mean, if you go back to 2012, it's almost at 90% approving. So it does fluctuate. We do know that across the region, and Pew Research has done some good work on this well, 92% of Arabs believe in democracy. They believe in liberal forms of democracy. Now, I think that what we're seeing is, the reflection of the reality that things are awful in the Arab world today. When we look at Syria, when we look at what's happening in Iraq, parts of Libya, it is a fearful process. But at its core, when we've done really good attitudinal surveys, we do see a very positive view about democracy. Can democracy work here right now? Well, unfortunately, some will say that's problematic because how are we going to get there?
I just want to ask you, when you use the word democracy, do you understand it as they crave and want Western-style democracy?
The polls show that it means liberal, Western-type democracy, a competitive process, free and fair elections. Absolutely.
All right. We got about a minute left. Arab Spring, Arab Winter, I guess is what we would be, and some people would say now. What's next? What comes next? Where do we head from here? You don't have to use one of those little terms, but...
Yeah, and I think that it's always unfair to think about a term because, the spring is continuing if we want to use that term, but, the protest, everyday, I think, forms of disobedience are happening across the region. People are still living, and I think one of the things that we have failed to recognize is that we just see war, but there are a lot of success stories in the Arab world that are, I think, being used to challenge government today. We see fighting for liberal spaces amongst Arab youth like never before. The media landscape, and again, it's particularly sort of the unofficial media landscape, whether it's citizen journalism, whether it's new women's centers, whether it's new forms of entrepreneurship, all of these are signs of hope. I don't think that, we can for sure say that 10 to 15 years from now will look the same like today. We have to have a long view of the region. And this is a temporary blip, I think, but the region, if there's any confidence or any optimism that I have of the region, it's because of those youth, because they fundamentally think in a way that's more progressive, they're more educated, they're more urban, cosmopolitan today. And it's hard to take a 20-year-old seriously, but when they're 35 and 40 and they're the decision makers of the society and the technocrats, that's when I will have optimism. So demography, I think, is something that we need to take comfort in.
I got just a bit of time, and I want to put up this last graph because it raises a question for me. So this is another question from that PR agency. Here's the question. Following the Arab Spring, I feel the Arab world is better off. On this question, when it was asked in 2012, 72% strongly agreed that things are better off. It's declined since then, Bessma. Last year, 38% agreed that the Arab world is better off post Arab Spring. So it's a sharp decline. And I guess what my question is people just get exhausted. It's been a long road for these people. And yet you find hope that they will persevere, that they just won't throw their hands up and say, the old way really sucked. But at least there was stability. At least there wasn't war and chaos. Maybe it's just time to just go back to the old ways.
Well, if you ask that particular question, they will not say, let's go back to the old ways. So that's really important. It's not to say that they are happy with the status quo or this is enough or that they aren't questioning how they fought for their own revolutions, particularly if you look at Egypt feeling that perhaps they should have done more than just leave the square. There's a lot of questioning. However, the point is that group of young people will be the leaders of their society. It's fate, it's mortality. They will be the leaders of the society. So take comfort in knowing that those young people are impressive. those young people, despite having dysfunctional governments, despite having, I think, what are corrupt and incapable governments of governing in a fair and equitable manner, those young people will be in power eventually, and that's what gives me comfort.
Thank you. I always like when we challenge predominant narratives, so thank you for doing that. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.